Hi, everybody. We are continuing where we left off last time by talking about the concept of taking creative risks. We went through a list the last time that we met together here online, and we were talking about the benefits of taking creative risks, the fact that when we take those risks and we make ourselves vulnerable, that we learn how to become more creative, we learn how to fail forward, we learn to basically break through the limitations that have been placed on us or that we have placed on ourselves. So we're going to continue where we left off. We are now on point 4, and we're going to go through the next 4 more points, and then we'll wrap up concentration 1. You'll notice on your syllabus that the semester is broken down into 4 different concentrations. So we'll be finishing up our first concentration at the end of the lecture today. I'm going to go ahead and jump on to the PowerPoint and we'll get started. So we talked about the ideas of breaking through limitations. We talked about how art and being creative can help us to learn how to fail and fail forward, to overcome the restrictions of making mistakes and kind of that fear of failure, and we learn to fail forward. Then we talked about the concept of limitations making us more creative. And if you guys remember, we saw the really cool music video by OK Go and how they purposely put limitations on themselves so that they would become more creative in the process in that 4.2 second music video. So we'll pick up where we left off with point 4, which is when we take creative risks, what we're doing is that we refuse to play it safe. And I have examples of art and photography for each one of these points, so we'll be going through those pieces of artwork as we talk about the different benefits. So number 4 is when we take creative risks, we refuse to play it safe. The image that I have to discuss this particular bullet point is a pretty powerful image, and honestly one that it just shakes us to our core when we look at it. And the more that we spend time with it, the more we kind of realize, particularly connected to the date, what this image is all about. But let's talk a little bit about what happened prior to this image. We'll talk about the image itself and a few events that occurred after this image was taken and publicized on a wide scale. And I also want to talk about how this is a photograph not just of the people that are in the photograph and listed in the title, but actually the person behind the lens. And we're going to talk about Will Counts a little bit as well. But let's talk about the image itself. You'll notice the date there is 1957. And the location of this image was in Little Rock, Arkansas. Now, if you remember back to your government classes, your history classes, this was a time of desegregation. Particularly in the South, where they were having the integration of black students, African American students, into formerly all-white high schools. So we're talking about really the high point of the civil rights movement, all of the tension, all of the events and emotional impact of that particular time in our country. So let's talk a little bit how this applies to creative risk. I want to talk about the photograph, I want to talk about the title. The individual that's closest to us as viewers, the African American student, her name is listed there in the title. That is Elizabeth Eckford, who was attending a formerly all-white high school for the first time. This is her first day of school in her new desegregated high school. Elizabeth Eckford, 14 years old at the time that this photograph was taken. Some interesting things about this that Elizabeth Eckford has recalled about that day is traditionally in the past when she would get up and go to school, her parents would always play the radio. It was just kind of their morning routine to flip on the radio. And Elizabeth noticed that this particular morning her parents did not turn the radio on. And she was curious as to why they wouldn't do that, and eventually would find out that the reason they didn't turn the radio on was that they didn't want Elizabeth to be aware of what she was heading into and the dangerous situation that she was heading into. So her parents drove her to school that morning and had to drop her off a couple of blocks from the high school due to the massive crowd and the presence of the National Guard that had shown up at the high school that day. So Elizabeth Eckford walks a couple of blocks to the entrance of her high school and immediately is confronted with an angry mob. People that did not want African American students to be at school. The National Guard was there to prevent their entrance into the school and to provide crowd control. As Elizabeth Eckford is making her way through the crowd, people begin screaming at her. People spit on her. People are throwing things at her. They're screaming names at her. They're calling her by racial slurs as she makes her way into the building. One of the students that was there to protest the Little Rock Nine, the group that will eventually become the Little Rock Nine, was a student named Hazel Bryan, and she is the student that is there with her mouth open that's shown right behind Elizabeth Eckford. And Will Counts, who was a photojournalist there in Little Rock, showed up that day. Now, I want to talk about that. Now, we've talked about the image, clearly a powerful image, a very upsetting image to look at, but I want to talk a little bit about the person behind the lens. We can, rightfully so, get caught up in what's going on in the image, but we also need to realize that not only are there human beings in this image, but there's a human being behind the lens. Will Counts put himself in an incredibly dangerous and tumultuous situation. He was a photojournalist for the local newspaper in Little Rock and had decided to take his camera down to this scene, which would have been incredibly upsetting, incredibly scary. And as a result of him taking that risk, and as a result of Will Counts putting himself in an uncomfortable situation, we've got one of the most powerful images from the civil rights movement. I'm sure he would not have put himself in that situation if he had known how dangerous it actually was, but he did. He decided to get up and show up and take this image. As a result, this image was published a couple of days later. And as a result of Will Counts putting himself in that dangerous situation, America had an image in their living rooms on the front page of their paper that they could not ignore. One of the powers of photography is that once we see an image, we can't unsee it. And photography such as this image of Elizabeth Eckford and Hazel Bryan has the capacity to change something from simply being an issue that's happening to somebody else, somewhere else, to an issue that we have to deal with. It's not just racism. This is a 14-year-old student named Elizabeth Eckford. This is a 14-year-old student named Hazel Bryan, and this is the result of many, many years of tension in our country, and this is what it's come to. Once we were able to have access to this image, it suddenly became very real. This is not just an issue. These are real people. These are real lives. These are 14-year-old kids that are in the middle of this turmoil. So one of the benefits of taking creative risk is that we don't play it safe. We put ourselves in uncomfortable situations. And as a result, the story gets told. The voice of a 14-year-old scared student gets told. The story of what desegregation really means gets told. The story of racism has a face and a name to it. And that's the power of taking a creative risk. Now, kind of a closure, a bit of a closure to this story actually occurs with Oprah Winfrey. many, many years after this image was taken, about 30 years after this image was taken, Oprah Winfrey had the members of Little Rock Nine, these 9 African American students who went to the all-white high school there in Little Rock, Arkansas. Oprah Winfrey invited the members of the Little Rock Nine onto her stage to just talk about what that experience was, those first few weeks of high school, and what they went through. And Oprah Winfrey also invited Hazel Bryan, known as Hazel Massery now, and invited Hazel Bryan to meet Elizabeth Eckford for the first time on the Oprah Winfrey Show. As a result, they were able to talk about this image. They were able to talk about the events that happened before this image. Hazel Bryan was able to tell a little bit of her story and the things that she was told as a child and the beliefs that had been instilled into her as a child and the things that she falsely believed that had brought her to this point. And they were able to kind of find a bit of a resolution to this. Hazel Bryan publicly apologized to Elizabeth Eckford there on the stage of the Oprah Winfrey Show. So a little bit of closure to a very, very powerful image from the civil rights movement. So we refuse to play it safe. Number 5 on our list is that when we take creative risk, we find our voice. We find our voice. Now that kind of comes on the foothills of the last image that we just saw. As a result of taking creative risk, we find our voice. We're able to talk about how we feel about certain events, which takes us to the next image that we're going to look at for point number 5. This is an image of a mural done by Pablo Picasso in 1937. I'm sure it's an image that you've seen before. It's in a lot of history textbooks. It's part of a lot of popular culture, and we kind of see this image bouncing around. But you may not know the story behind it and the events that occurred to cause Pablo Picasso to paint this. Before we talk about the image itself, I want to talk about the size. Now, I haven't really talked a lot about scale so far in the semester. We haven't really talked about the dimensions of different paintings, but it's particularly relevant with this work because I want you to know that this is a mural. So this is a wall. It's painted onto a wall. It doesn't hang on the wall. It actually is the wall. This mural that Picasso did in 1937 is 25 feet long and 11 feet high. So think about what it would feel like to stand in front of this mural that's truly larger than life. It would just visually swallow you up, and that's very much intentional by Picasso. Let's talk a little bit about the biography. This is not a pleasant painting. I don't think that any of us would look at this and say, man, I want to hang this over my couch. I want to look at this every day, because it's not pleasant. Sometimes as viewers, we think that art is supposed to make us feel good all the time, that art is supposed to be a pleasurable experience, that art should be pleasant to look at. And many times in art history, an artist will sacrifice aesthetic beauty to tell the truth, and that's certainly the case with Guernica. The background behind this mural takes us all the way back to the 26th of April, 1937. Picasso was a native of Spain, and although he wasn't in the country at the time that the event occurred, he heard about the events of the 26th of April, 1937. What was going on in a political sense was you've got the Nazi regime in Germany. So the Nazis are attempting to take power. They're slowly making their way across Germany and other parts of Europe in an attempt to gain control over these countries. You also have, at the same time, a very corrupt government in Spain. And the corrupt leaders that were in power at Spain at the time made an under-the-table deal with Nazi Germany. And the deal was that the Nazi Air Force could fly over the border of Spain uncontested and test their air weaponry on the small town of Guernica, which is located in northern Spain. So on April 26, 1937, the Nazis fly over the border. They fly over the town of Guernica, and for 2 hours they unleashed explosives, 31 tons of explosives on the town of Guernica. There was no political reason for this. There was no military reason for them to bomb Guernica. There was no advance warning that this was going to happen. They simply were testing their air weaponry and how many people they could kill in a certain period of time. So for 2 hours, 31 tons of explosives were dropped on the town of Guernica. 1/3 of the population was killed that day. That's 1,600 people. They bombed at noon when they knew the most people would be outside of buildings walking around, and that's where they would have the most casualties. So it's not a pleasant painting. Picasso is painting what it must have felt like to be in Guernica at that time. There's body parts laying around. There's people running through the streets. There's buildings on fire. There's a man trapped in a building over on the right-hand side. There's animals that are running loose in the street. There's chaos. Our eye doesn't land anywhere because our eye doesn't really know where to go because the scene is so chaotic. Over on the left-hand side, we've got smoke going out of buildings. We've got a woman that's holding her dead child as she's running through the streets. It's not a pleasant painting to look at. But if we look at the date, we realize why Pablo Picasso painted this. This is 1937. We don't have television. We don't have news channels. We don't have Twitter. We don't have any way to let the world know what a corrupt government did to its own people. So when Pablo Picasso was asked in 1937 to paint a mural for the World's Fair, this is the topic that he chose. You'll notice that the entire mural is done in grayscale, blacks and whites and gray. This was intentional because this is Pablo Picasso's headline. This is his newspaper headline to tell the world what his country did to its own citizens. This has been called his most powerful anti-war statement. It's called the art world's most powerful political statement, but this expresses Pablo Picasso's outrage and his need to sacrifice a, quote, pretty painting to be the voice for those in Guernica. This is his visual response to what had happened in his country that day. It's also a good example for not only the importance of looking at a time period, a social and historical context for the time that a painting was produced. So 1937, we know what's going on in the world, but also how our perspective changes when we view a work of art. I remember studying this painting as an undergraduate, as a graduate student, and although it's extremely powerful and impactful as a student, I remember that this work became even more powerful in 2001. I know that some students are too young to remember the events of September 11th, 2001, but I've not looked at this work in the same way after 9/11. When our country had been attacked and when we realized that this was a senseless act of violence, that the attacks on the World Trade Center were not for military reasons or political reasons, it was just simply out of hatred, and innocent people were losing their lives over the attacks of 9/11. And I just remember I was in graduate school during that time period, and I remember the fear and the chaos and just all of those feelings of outrage that this attack had occurred to my country. So looking at Guernica now is a much different experience than it was, you know, in the 1990s prior to 9/11. I definitely view this painting in a different way. So it's a good example of not only looking at the date and understanding what was going on globally, but also realizing how our perspective changes as viewers when we look at this. And my perspective definitely different post 9/11 than it was prior to 9/11. Also an interesting story to kind of wrap this up. Picasso was very outspoken about Nazi Germany And as a result, he was often a target for the Nazi officers. They would come and investigate his work. They would go through his studio. They would interrogate him. And Picasso's not really known for being a guy that was particularly receptive to being questioned about his work. Picasso was rather abrasive as an individual and certainly non-compliant when it came to Nazi involvement with his artwork. So later in the 1940s, when Paris was occupied by the Germans, a Nazi officer came by Picasso's studio and was kind of poking around and wanting to know what Picasso was up to and the kind of work that he was doing. He was under constant scrutiny. And Picasso had a print of Guernica there in his studio. And as the Nazi officers kind of investigating and looking around Picasso's studio, he tapped the print of Guernica, and he looked at Picasso and tapped the print, and he said, "Did you do this?" And Picasso looked the Nazi officer dead in the eye, and he said, "No, you did this." So as a result, art is not just Picasso's voice, but it also becomes our voice as well. Number 6 on our list of benefits of taking creative risks is that we become a voice for others. Again, this is kind of on the foothills of the Guernica piece and Picasso being a voice for others, but I'm going to show you another image that shows us number 6 kind of in a visual way, becoming a voice for others. Again, another image that you are probably familiar with, one that you have seen in your history textbooks. This is a photograph by Dorothea Lange titled Migrant Mother, and it is also from 1937. Let me give you a little background, because even though the image may be familiar to you, you may not be familiar with the story behind it and the names behind it. Let's start off by talking about Dorothea Lange. Dorothea Lange was employed by the United States government in the 1930s. And her job, female artist, female photographer, her job was to travel around the western part of the United States and document the effects of the Great Depression and the drought that was occurring out west during this time period. So photography in 1937, very different than it is today. We pull out our iPhones and we snap photographs and we're able to publish those within a matter of seconds. But in 1937, taking a photograph was a pretty labor-intensive and very expensive process. So to go out west to take these photographs, to publish them, you would have to have very heavy camera equipment loaded up in your car. You would have to take all your chemicals with you to be able to develop those photographs. It was a pretty intensive process. So Dorothea Lange loads up her car. I've got an image of her there in the upper right-hand side of the screen. There she is with her camera. I wonder what she would think about iPhones as she holds her 80-pound camera in her lap. But she loaded up her camera and all of her equipment and started out west. As she would travel throughout the country, she would basically meet individuals, meet families, document them with her photographs, hear a little bit about their story. And as she does that, she becomes a voice for the voiceless, including this image of Migrant Mother. Dorothea Lange was traveling through New Mexico when she came upon a car by the side of the road, and all of the tires were off the car. The car was just sitting there, the car carriage, the tires were gone. She looks to the other side of the road, and there's kind of a lean-to shack that had been set up. And underneath that shack was Florence Thompson, the woman that you see in the photograph, and 3 of her 7 children. So you see the 2 boys on either side, and she has an infant in her lap. The father of the children, her husband, and the rest of the children had gone out into the fields in an attempt to find food. And they were basically living on frozen vegetables that they could find and whatever birds they could kill. They had just sold the tires off of their automobile to be able to have some money for the next few days. Now, if you look at the title, it's Migrant Mother. They were migrant workers, and they've just sold the tires off of their car. So they are in a desperate situation. They're at the end of their rope because they've just sold the one thing that funded their life, this car, You can't be a migrant worker if you don't have a way to get to the next job. So they're in a desperate situation. The woman that you see in the image, Florence Thompson, was 32 years old at the time that this photograph was taken, which just astounds me because she looks so much older. The worry and the stress and the financial situation that they were facing, the family situation they were facing, has obviously had an effect on her physically. Now, again, we have to think about not just this image, which is incredibly powerful, but we also have to think about the person behind the lens and what a risk and how emotional this must have been for Dorothea Lange as the photographer. And I think about this because I went to Kenya a few years ago, and I was there with the medical team. We were going to run some medical clinics down in some of the worst slum areas of Kenya and some of the most remote areas of Kenya. And I remember thinking, as I was planning this trip and as I was packing for the trip, I'm going to take my camera and I want to photograph the things that I see there in Kenya, and I want to have a big art exhibit when I get back. That was my plan. When I got to Nairobi and when we went out to visit some of the families, we were basically standing on a landfill, one of the largest landfills in Africa. And people were living there. That was their home, on this huge landfill, this big heap of trash. And I'm standing there 360 degrees surrounded by sights that I had never seen, poverty that I had never experienced ever, and just the smell. I remember the smell more than anything. And I remember standing there thinking, I'm holding a camera that costs more money than these people will ever see in their lifetimes. And all of a sudden, it felt really wrong to pull out my expensive American camera and take photographs of a situation that these people were facing every single day of their life. I was going to get back on my comfortable bus and sleep in my comfortable hotel and fly back on my comfortable plane, but this was their reality, and it all of a sudden seemed incredibly uncomfortable for me to take photographs, so I didn't. Dorothea Lange must have kind of felt the same way. There she is with her clean car and her camera equipment, and she has to photograph these people that are in an extremely desperate situation, and how incredibly uncomfortable that would have been for everybody involved. But she took that risk, very tastefully asked Miss Thomas if she could take some photographs. The kids didn't want to have their picture taken. That's why they're kind of turning away. They were shy. But takes a few photographs, so you may see this photograph from a different angle. Took 3 or 4 different photographs, and then did what I think would have had to have been the most difficult thing, and that is get back in her car and leave. Leave these people, not knowing how their story was going to end, not knowing what they were going to eat for dinner that night, but get in your car and leave to do the rest of your job that you've been hired to do. I would imagine that would be incredibly, incredibly difficult for Dorothea Lange. So we have to remember that there's somebody behind the lens as well. Now, the result is that taking that risk, putting yourself out there, putting yourself in that uncomfortable situation, gave a voice to Florence Thompson and thousands of other people that were in the same situation. This photograph, once it was published, had the same result, very much like the Elizabeth Eckford photograph with Will Counts. No longer was this just an issue that was happening to somebody else in a place far away. This was a face. This was a name. These were children that had done nothing to find themselves in this situation. This photograph caused reform. It caused awareness of the issue. It made us say, how can something like this happen in our country? How can there be so much poverty to its own citizens? So as a result, we have government programs in place to help people in these situations, and it caused reform. This photograph gave a voice to Florence Thompson and the other people that had been devastated by the Great Depression, and it becomes a face and a person and not just an issue. So as a result, art becomes a voice for others. Number 7 on our list is when you take creative risks, you have a greater understanding of the unknown. When we take creative risks, we have a greater understanding of the unknown. One of the questions that I like to pose in class is to ask the class, what does Jesus look like? And when I ask that, I get the same responses. Well, he had long, brown, curly hair, and he had a beard and wore a robe. And we have a visual description of Christ, but nowhere in the Bible does it actually talk about what Jesus looked like. Yet, throughout history, we have the same depiction of Jesus, thanks to artists. Now, a lot of religious artwork is there because it was produced during a time period where people could not read the Bible. The illiteracy rate was very high, and a lot of people couldn't read biblical text. So if you can't read biblical text, you have to have a way to understand biblical concepts. You take the abstract and you put it into the physical. A lot of you guys did that with your self-portrait projects. You're taking the abstract, your beliefs, your passion, your history, your stories, and you're putting that into a physical object. The next work of art that we're going to see helps us to understand biblical concepts by putting it in a visual format. This is the Incredulity of St. Thomas. Sometimes it's also called the Doubting of St. Thomas. This is a painting done in 1601. So again, the illiteracy rate would have been very high during this time period. Done in 1601 by the artist Caravaggio. Caravaggio, just for disclosure, one of my favorite artists, so I get super excited when I talk about Caravaggio. I tend to fangirl a little bit, so just bear with me. The Doubting of St. Thomas by Caravaggio in 1601 is based on the story of the disciple Thomas. Now, if you're not familiar with the story, I'll kind of catch you up very quickly. If you want to look at the biblical account, it's in John chapter 20, verse 24. Thomas was one of the disciples that had seen Jesus be crucified. And he saw Jesus' lifeless body being put into the tomb. When Jesus arose from the grave 3 days later, Thomas started hearing the other disciples claiming that Jesus was alive. And they had seen Jesus and they had talked to Jesus. This is where we get the phrase doubting Thomas from. If you've ever heard that phrase, this is the origin of it. Thomas refused to believe any of the disciples and refused to believe that Jesus was alive. And Thomas stated that I will not believe that it is the risen Christ until I can put my fingers in his wound and I can actually see him and touch his skin and see his face. And Thomas basically said, you know what, I just don't believe that any of this is true. Depicted in the image in front of you, we have the moment that Jesus appears to Thomas. And Thomas is allowed to put his finger in Jesus's wound on his side where the sword had pierced him. And we get this wonderful moment where Thomas realizes that everything that Jesus said would happen has happened. Now, the cool thing about this image and what I love about Caravaggio is that he has pushed all the action to the foreground. We are in the circle right there next to Thomas. Because if we're entirely honest with ourselves and if we're entirely transparent, we have had moments, a lot like Thomas, where we have doubted that Jesus would do what he said he would do. And we have had moments where we've doubted that Christ is who he really claims to be. And we've had moments where we've doubted that Christ is going to come through for us. So if we're incredibly honest, we are in that huddle right there with Thomas. And I love how Caravaggio just opens up that circle and includes us in it. But what is really cool is the expression on Thomas's face there. This is the moment that he realizes that this is the risen Savior, and he gets it, and he knows that Christ is everything that he said he is. And I love that moment. What I also love about what Caravaggio has done is you'll notice that their clothes are not fancy. This is not something that's happening to superheroes that are wearing polished prince clothes, and it's kind of happening over there. Their clothes are dirty, they're torn, they're just like us. They're just busted up human beings that are trying to do their best to believe. And I love the fact that Caravaggio has not depicted them as superheroes. They're ripped, they're dirty, they're torn, and they're one of us. We're very much a part of that circle. So again, this is helping us understand the unknown. We get a glimpse of who Jesus is as he very gently places Thomas's hand there on his side. And I love that about Caravaggio. The next image and the last one that we're going to talk about, the last bullet point we're going to talk about, is when we take creative risk, we can make the extraordinary out of the ordinary. This kind of goes on the heels of what we looked at with the Phil Hansen TED Talk a few class sessions ago. When we create the extraordinary out of the ordinary, if you remember the Starbucks the Starbucks cups that Phil Hansen used for some of his projects, and how that was taking the ordinary and making something extraordinary out of it. The last artist that I want to talk about, I don't have a title for this and I don't have a date for it because the image has kind of multiple works in it, but I want to talk about the work of Eric Day, who creates portraits out of thumbtacks, push pins. Usually 11,000 to 12,000 push pins per work. And I included this image because I wanted you to see that these are actually just thumbtacks. These are just push pins that everybody has. They're not specially made. They're not specially colored for him to use. These are just ordinary thumbtacks that we all have kind of laying around our desk. And out of those ordinary push pins, he makes something extraordinary. Sometimes there's a stereotype about art that to create, quote, good art or successful art, you have to have really expensive supplies and you have to have a certain kind of paint and you have to have a certain kind of paintbrush that's made out of the hair of a goat, of an alpine goat from the Alps or something, that it's somehow unattainable for the rest of us that don't have access to that. And our 8th bullet point says that we can create the extraordinary out of the ordinary, that you can take something that we all have and make something incredibly extraordinary out of that. And the work of Eric Day does just like that. All right, I'm going to flip back to my screen here, and that wraps up our discussion on taking creative risks. When we come back next time, we'll actually be starting that second concentration. So I look forward to that. We got another individual project that's coming up for that, and we'll kind of touch on that. I'm going to go ahead and make that available on the Canvas page, but we'll talk about the project in detail when we come back next time. All right, you guys have an amazing day. We'll see you later.